All right, so our next session here in the Presidential Learning Center is entitled Our Undemocratic Constitution. And I'm excited to introduce our next speaker for a couple of reasons. One, we actually went to the same school at the same time, our alumni of Claremont-McKenna College, one of the finest colleges in all the land. So it gives me particular pleasure to introduce Dr. Zachary Courser. Dr. Courser is the research director of the Dreyer Roundtable and a visiting assistant professor of government at Claremont-McKenna College, and has published articles on the connection between political parties and democratic participation, and is a contributor and editor of the forthcoming volume, Parchment Barriers, Political Polarization and the Limits of Constitutional Order. Professor Courser has taught political science courses at a number of institutions, and this fall, together with Professor Eric Helland, Professor Courser established Policy Lab, an innovative new undergraduate course focused on public policy analysis of real-world problems in coordination with a D.C. think tank. He has experience working in Washington, D.C., both on Capitol Hill and as the director of the Claremont-McKenna College's Washington program, and is a regular commentator on KPCC's Air Talk program, and frequently gives talks on American politics. He holds a master's and doctoral degree in government from the University of Virginia and a bachelor's degree in government from Claremont-McKenna College. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Zach Courser.
Thanks very much, Tony, for that kind introduction, and my thanks to the Reagan Library for this kind invitation. I feel it appropriate to start with a few comments about President Reagan and put that in the context of today's talk about our undemocratic Constitution. When Reagan left office in January of 1989, he gave a farewell address, and one of his chief concerns in that farewell address was that America was losing interest in its own history. He said that we should be more concerned about having what he called an informed patriotism, and he desired more attention to American history. Well, what does he mean by that? Well, I think by informed patriotism, he's referring back to something that even our founders were aware of, and that is the intimate link between education and being a citizen in a self-governing society. The importance of civics to education cannot be underestimated in the United States. In fact, a colleague of mine at Claremont-McKenna College recently published a book that I commend to you, a gentleman named George Thomas, who's a professor in the government department, called The Founders and the Idea of a National University. And in this book, he describes how the founding generation was aware that in order to have this whole construct of the Constitution work, we needed an informed and educated citizenry. Professor Thomas notes in speaking about George Washington and his concern for education that, quote, there is a delicate and crucial link between education and Republican government. Reagan also worried in this farewell address that there would be a, quote, erosion of the American spirit if people were not more aware of our history. And I think Constitution Day gives us an opportunity to prevent that from happening, to re-energize our interest in our government and to remember the building of our nation and our republic and how the truths of 1787 are still our truths today. So I'm very pleased to speak about the Constitution on Constitution Day, which is an opportunity to educate ourselves about the Constitution, remind ourselves of some of our founding principles. So in the spirit of Reagan's desire for more informed patriotism, let's talk a bit about the Constitution, this most essential document in our republic. So to begin with, I wanted to talk a little bit about partisanship, because it certainly, I think, feeds into our discussion about majority faction, which I'll be getting to and talking about our undemocratic Constitution. But it also, I think, is a problem we're faced with today generally in our politics. I think it's worth mentioning that Constitution Day was the brainchild of not a Republican, but a Democrat, Senator Robert Byrd from West Virginia, who considered himself a great scholar of the Constitution, was very interested in the Senate and always reminding the Senate of the Constitution, and helped to create Constitution Day in 2005. My point of bringing this up is not only to point out Senator Byrd's accomplishment in creating Constitution Day, but also to remind us that the Constitution must extend beyond partisanship. And that is to say, we all of us, all Americans, should be united by the principles of the Constitution, and that we run afoul of the founding principles, and frankly, we move somewhat beyond politics when we disagree about the fundamental characteristics of our country as represented by the Constitution. The alternative to the Constitution would be an alternative to politics, and that, as we have seen in our history, is very dangerous. So in speaking about polarized politics, I speak after having finished about a year-long research project at Claremont McKenna College on discovering whether or not our polarized politics might have its roots in disagreements over the Constitution. Is there something more fundamental about our partisan disagreement that goes beyond simple policy and goes more towards some bedrock assumptions about the Constitution itself? And in the course of a year working with colleagues, we uncovered some interesting and I think unsurprising facts about our current politics. We sort of approached this idea in thinking about the different institutions of government, looking at Congress, looking at the executive, looking at the Supreme Court, thinking about concepts as represented by the Constitution, such as federalism, and how these had all been impacted by our more polarized politics. And what we found was not heartening, although unsurprising. We found that the executive today, in both parties, our executives are motivated and pushed by policy goals that often test the limits of administrative power and the separation of powers. We find that Congress is unable to govern. I think this is a palpable fact to anyone who's a regular newspaper reader, that the institution itself is not functioning as it should. We see that the courts are pressured to respond to these defects, to solve our most bitter political disagreements, sometimes being pushed beyond their own limits as an institution in the separation of powers. And another fact we found, speaking about political parties themselves, is a defect in our political parties today. That is a desire that a simple majority should control all of our government, and a disregard for our constitutional limits on majority power. There seems to be an active forgetting of the reason why our Constitution is, in essence, creating a republic, not a democracy, and remembering what the difference between these two ideas are, and that there are many very important and critical reasons why our founding generation put some space between the people and the government. And part of my talk here today is going to address this constitutional space, this distance between the people and the government, and understanding why it exists and why it should endure, and why we should remind ourselves as we leave the classroom and move into politics and being citizens, that a simple majority is a dangerous thing. So in my introductory government class, I often ask the question on the first paper assignment. This is after we've covered the founding, we've read the Federalist Papers, which I'll quote from a little bit later. We've had a chance to marinate a bit in the founding generation and come to some conclusions about the Declaration and the Constitution. And I usually pose this question to my Gov 20 students. The Constitution begins with the phrase, "we the people," and then goes on to place many obstacles between the people's will and the government. Is the Constitution therefore undemocratic? Well, the answer, of course, is a qualified yes. It is, in many respects, undemocratic. But what I find, and I do this purposefully, is that the very word undemocratic causes students to enter into some kind of tailspin. What? Undemocratic? That's bad, right? We can't have anything undemocratic. Democracy is its own virtue. If the Constitution is undemocratic, then there must be something wrong with the Constitution. But that's precisely why I assign this topic, is because I want students to meditate a bit about why it is that there are certain features of the Constitution that don't say, every decision is automatically done for the people, that vox populi does not always mean vox Dei. So let's talk a little bit about the political philosophy that underlies our Constitution and some of the experience, some of the hard-won experience that came during that period between 1776 and our independence and the writing of the Constitution. These were obviously difficult years. War, deprivation, uncertainty abounded during these years, but they taught the founding generation a great deal about self-government. And I think without this experience, one could wonder if we would ever have been capable of, as a people, coming together and ratifying the document that we now today call our Constitution. So, what is it that happened during these 11 years? What experience was won? What knowledge was gained that helped us as a people to decide to choose a Republican government in the form of the Constitution? Well, the one guide to this, and I've already sort of tipped my hand a bit, is the Federalist Papers. I think they're a wonderful device not only for teaching but understanding the Constitution. And I'll be quoting in particular from James Madison and his understanding and explanation of how it is that the Constitution became the document that it is, and how he defended it against the Anti-Federalists and the roadmap in which he paints for understanding why it is that the Constitution came together the way it did and why it should be ratified. And I think the most famous and yet one of the most dense and I think difficult papers in the Federalist Papers that gets to the core of Madison's understanding of constitutional government, American constitutional government, is Federalist 10, where he speaks of factional government and the dangers of faction. And I think, we have had a chance to read this paper many times, perhaps even teach it, but I think it deserves further study, and I think it yields more understanding the more you seek to understand exactly what Madison means, to take it apart. And I think a lot of people sort of stop at the notion of faction and say, oh yes, we're all factious, so therefore we need an extended republic. But I think the idea is deeper and more interesting. And I think it has much to do with Madison's perception of human nature and how he sees us as political animals. And he sees us as extremely imperfect, that we are so often motivated by our self-love, our self-interest, how vulnerable we are collectively to be intemperate and passionate, to make short-term considerations, and to always sacrifice individuals and minorities in the balance. I'll talk a little bit about the experience of these 11 years and then talk a little bit more about Madison's ideas about our human nature and its defects. So first of all, during these 11 years, many states had to go about the business of not being a colony anymore and actually becoming something of a semi-sovereign state. They had to write their own constitutions. And they made many assumptions about self-government in writing these constitutions, many of which proved to be quite wrong. Madison goes through in Federalist 48 and gives us some insights into some of the errors that they made in terms of trying to demonstrate why it is that the federal Constitution came together the way in which it did. Madison points out a couple of examples, sort of hall of shame of state constitutions where things went radically wrong. He points to Virginia. He says that one of the common mistakes that so many states had made was in giving too much power to the legislature. It seems obvious why you would do that, though. Why would you give so much power to the legislature? Why is it that Congress is Article 1 in the Constitution? Well, I think it's obvious. It's because it's so close to the people. We, the people of the United States. The legislature is the embodiment of our will as a people. And of course, thinking about the experience of the Revolutionary War, the difficulties with King George, the hatred of executive power, Americans were motivated to limit executive power and to aggrandize legislative power. And they did so in their state constitutions. What was the result? Well, it wasn't very good. In Virginia, for example, the legislature became somewhat tyrannical. It tended to dictate to the executive. It tried to administer where it should pass laws. It controlled the courts and tried to decide rights that were supposed to be embodied in the Virginia Constitution. Madison also points to the example of Pennsylvania, which had created a similarly weak executive. Pennsylvania's legislature violated trial by jury. They manipulated judicial salaries to push judges to conclude decisions the way they wanted. And they did not submit legislation for public consideration. They essentially tried to work in many ways in private. Well, what does this tell us? Well, it tells us that even though the legislature is the embodiment of the people in the most direct way, that it still needs to be limited, that it still can be tyrannical, that there is such a thing as not only a majority, but a majority tyranny. Madison quotes from his good friend Thomas Jefferson in Jefferson's Notes on the State of Virginia. Jefferson's complaining about the various features of the Virginia Constitution and the tyrannous legislature, and quoting Jefferson, Madison writes, "An elective despotism was not the government we fought for." And this is the tricky thing. This is the tricky thing. How do we find a balance between having a popular politics and yet having one that respects rights, that respects the rights of individuals, respects the rights of minorities, that is wise and temperate? This is a challenge that at first seems difficult to overcome, because it is not a defect necessarily of government. It is a defect in the judgment of people, all of us, something that we cannot alienate ourselves from. It is part of our human natures. Madison goes on in Federalist 10 to give us many historical examples. They abound about how badly democracies had failed in ancient times. The lack of infallibility of reason in the decisions that democracies made politically. As I had said before, natural human self-love and self-interest, and how they overwhelmed judgment and wisdom, and how vulnerable these majorities are to intemperate passions and short-term considerations. Madison doesn't quote directly, but we could think, for example, about Thucydides and the example of the Peloponnesian Wars, how the Athenians were pushed one way or the other by one demagogue or another to make intemperate, bad decisions that imperiled their democracy. So Madison sees as the primary challenge for the Constitution as securing what he says, quote, "the public good and private rights against the danger of majority factions, while preserving, quote, the spirit and the form of popular government." This is a tough challenge, one that we continue to battle with today. I mean, it's another thing to think about, another consideration that we can have about our Constitution today, is that ultimately it is us that make up the Constitution. It is not a perfect mechanism that will tick if we keep it wound indefinitely like some kind of political machine. It relies on us and our understanding as citizens to work, to function. So without painting too gloomy a picture of human nature and suggesting that Madison and the founding generation thought of Americans as being a bunch of inflammatory dolts who have to be kept away from the precious machinery of government, I wanted to quote a little bit from Federalist 55, which is one of my favorite Federalist Papers. Federalist 55 is, the subject is, how much representation is enough? Almost everything that the Federalists proposed was challenged in some way by a factional interest, such as various AntiFederalists. And one thing in particular was how the House of Representatives should be put together. How many representatives is enough? Was one question. How long should they serve? Should it be 1 year? Should it be 2, 4? How do we put this institution together? And in Federalist 55, Madison, who's very scholarly, very temperate, very hard and difficult to rile, he seems a little annoyed here and is frustrated with the Anti-Federalists and their concerns. He feels as though the Anti-Federalists find that there is almost no safety mechanism possible that could prevent some kind of corruption. That the Anti-Federalists are so pessimistic about human nature and the potential for corruption that they're taking away the ability of the legislature to even function. Either it would be a huge mass of people that could never manage to deliberate, or they would be able to serve such slight terms that they would never be able to learn anything about legislation or function as a legislature. So Madison, at the end of Federalist 55, after being very frustrated by the image that Anti-Federalists had made of politics and the American people, he writes, "As there is a degree of depravity in mankind which requires a certain degree of circumspection and distrust, so there are other qualities in human nature which justify a certain portion of esteem and confidence. Republican government presupposes the existence of these qualities in a higher degree than any other form. Were the pictures which have been drawn by the political jealousies of some among us faithful likenesses of the human character, the inference would be that there is not sufficient virtue among men for self-government, and that nothing less than the chains of despotism can restrain them from destroying and devouring one another." Madison knew that there was sufficient virtue in human nature for self-government, but that we needed certain auxiliary precautions to distance our short-term passionate considerations from the actual enactment of legislation and the functioning of government. So how do we do that? How is it that the Constitution, what are the features of the Constitution that we should consider undemocratic? Well, in summary, I would put them in three different categories and talk a little bit about each of them with you, and giving some reason why they exist and giving some justification for why it is that they endure as a necessary part of our Constitution. The first, I think, is probably the most obvious, and that is indirect representation. As the Constitution was originally ratified, it was only the House of Representatives that was directly elected by the people. Otherwise, the other features of the Constitution were very much insulated from popular opinion. If we think about the Senate, for example, the Senate as it existed before the 17th Amendment, that is, the Senate that was elected by state legislatures. It wasn't the people that were speaking directly and voting for their senators, it was state legislatures, who the people did vote for, deciding on who the senators would be. And thinking about the term of the Senate, 6 years, 6 long years. Maybe it seems a bit shorter today, but in 1787, 6 years must have seemed like an eternity. And then you think about the fact that these senators are not elected en masse, that they have staggered re-elections every 2 years. A third of the Senate is re-elected. Why is this? Well, I think it's obvious, and I think it's one of the most Republican and frankly undemocratic features of our Constitution as it was ratified, and that is we need distance from the people. We need a place for deliberation. We need a place for calming passions. I've never liked the analogy much, but it does come from President Washington, so I'll say it anyway. He would describe the Senate as the saucer in which the tea is cooled. Basically saying that it calmed down our passions, that it gave a certain kind of space and ability for senators to make decisions about policy that were connected to popular opinion, but not entirely subject to them. The other great insulation that we see from popular opinion or popular will is in the executive, particularly in the way in which the executive is selected. I'm sure, thinking back to if you were teaching American politics, say around the year 2000, that this feature might have you might have become very aware of this, and your students might have asked you a lot of questions. I doubt they probably have in about 10 years or so. But there was a moment, a constitutional moment back in 2000 where this question really came to the fore. We do not have a directly elected executive. We have the Electoral College, and we have the state legislatures that truly decide who the president will be. Remembering back to the year 2000 and the fact that ultimately the decision was made by the Supreme Court that George W. Bush had won the election, that there existed an alternative, a constitutional one, to that decision. The decision was really up to, ultimately, the state of Florida. They could have convened their House of Representatives, and the House of Representatives could have voted to give their delegates to George W. Bush, even if they had determined, or some of them had determined, that Gore had actually won the popular vote. It was really the state legislature's decision. It's state legislatures that decide to give people the opportunity at the ballot box to decide who they want their presidents to be, but it's not the Constitution's method. The Constitution allows for it, but ultimately it's the states, the electors, and that decide who the president will be. I mean, it's interesting, too, speaking about the Constitution presidential elections, that I've read a couple of articles recently talking about the idea of the faithless elector. The idea that one of the reasons that we have the Electoral College is that the electors themselves may exercise some judgment in deciding who the president ought to be. That there is, at the very least, a potential for these electors to make a decision that is contrary to the ones that their voters or even their state legislatures have decided upon. Many states have tried to outlaw this. It's not exactly a well-trod area of case law. It's because it's really more of a political decision. And while there have been faithless electors in the past, they've usually been, one-offs, kind of unusual circumstances. We've never had the Electoral College fully assert itself, or some faction of the Electoral College assert itself in making an independent decision. But the potential remains. Why? Why is that? Why do we have this undemocratic feature? Well, for a couple of reasons. One was the founding generation's concern about executive power, generally speaking. I spoke earlier about the person of the king, King George, but particularly his administrators who were sent to the colonies to dictate policy to colonists. Colonists had a real dislike, almost hatred of executive power, and a distrust. They wanted a very weak executive, generally speaking, in the United States. And it was really what really convinced the Constitutional Convention about having a powerful executive was the person of George Washington. And it's interesting to understand why it is that George Washington was there, how it is that he became involved again in politics in the United States. After the war, he'd largely moved back to his farm at Mount Vernon and had decided, I've done my bit. Now it's time to follow the example of the great Cincinnatus and put down his weapons and return to his farm. Well, what happened was that the Articles of Confederation were not working very well. And in particular, in the state of Massachusetts, there was open rebellion. Shays' Rebellion, you may have heard of, where, as has become a common occurrence in American politics, it was a mortgage crisis. Farmers were unable to pay their debts. They were angry about the possibility of losing their farms, and so they wanted to shut down the courts physically and make it impossible for the courts to take their lands away from them. And it was this disorder, this disruption, that convinced Washington that his work was not done. And he came out of retirement, went to Massachusetts, personally helped to put down the rebellion. And this is 1786. By 1787, he was in Philadelphia. And he was there to say actually very little, but to be extremely symbolic at the Constitutional Convention. And his presence there convinced the delegates that who would likely wield these powers if we make a strong executive? And the answer was obvious. It'll be General Washington, so we can relax. We trust him. The people trust him. And we know for at least, 4 or 8 years, General Washington will set an example, hopefully, for our presidents to follow, for our executives to follow. But it was still a hard thing to win, to have a strong executive. And one of the contrivances that was used to convince wary or uncertain delegates to the convention to endorse this was to try to distance that president from the people. The Electoral College, in particular, being one of those devices. They had a concern about demagoguery. They had a concern about unprincipled men at this time coming before the American people and convincing them to elect them president. They wanted to make sure that there were many safeguards before that could ever happen. Under indirect representation, the last thing I'll mention is the Supreme Court, which of course is the sine qua non of indirect representation under the Constitution. The justices of the Supreme Court serve life terms. They are proposed by the executive. They are confirmed by the Senate. And yet they are a co-equal branch of government. Well, why is this? Why can't we have the people elect our judicial representatives? Why can't they serve brief terms of office? Well, it was a concern that the founding generation had about the independence of the judiciary and not making them subject to the legislature, not making them subject to the executive, and ultimately not making them subject to majorities. In a minute, I'll get to talking about the Bill of Rights as being one of the undemocratic features of our Constitution. But suffice it to say, the Supreme Court needed objectivity, it needed distance, it needed the opportunity to apply the Constitution and the laws. In some cases, essentially in disregard to popular opinion. So another feature of the Constitution that seems somewhat undemocratic is the separation of powers. And this gets back to the argument about how legislatures can become tyrannical, that we need to limit the legislature's power. So separation of powers is an idea that goes back to Montesquieu and the spirit of the laws. But as it applies to the American experience, as I was talking about Madison retelling the example of Pennsylvania and the example of Virginia, we cannot give too much power to a legislature because they will tend to become tyrannical. But yet we must maintain popular government and make sure that the popular will is represented in our government. So how do we do that? Well, one answer to that question is the separation of powers. That the House and the Senate must concert their activities in order to pass any legislation, Absolutely has to be the same bill that comes out of both houses before it can go to the president. But that the other two branches of government have to give their assent as well. That the president has the veto power, and that the Supreme Court, although this was only implied at the time, but it was, the decision was made part of case law in 1803 with Marbury versus Madison, that the Supreme Court also could weigh in and decide about the constitutionality of a law that Congress passed. So separation of powers makes it difficult for an interested majority to concert its power. Everyone must, all three branches of government must coordinate to make policy. The only exception to this would be a supermajority. Of course, the Congress could override the executive with a two-thirds vote of both houses. And of course, the final possibility really would be an amendment to the Constitution to change the Constitution itself, which of course we know is a very difficult thing to do. To imagine something that 3/4 of the states would ratify, it would have to be either so anodyne and boring as to invite no controversy whatsoever, or we would have to have a real consensus in our country about whether or not that should become part of our Constitution. The last thing I'll talk about in terms of the Constitution's curbs on popular control, its anti-democratic features, is the Bill of Rights. Now, the Bill of Rights is something of an afterthought to the Constitution, of course. These are the first 10 amendments to our Constitution. And they arise out of a concern of many in several states that our Constitution does not do enough to define and protect the the rights of minorities and individuals. It says a great many things about what the government cannot do in the articles, but it doesn't give any specifics about what our rights are as citizens. And some states made it a condition of their joining the Union, a condition of ratifying the Constitution, that there be a Bill of Rights passed by the first Congress, that we spell out exactly what it is that is beyond the limits of politics. What do I mean by that? I mean rights that are so fundamental to our ordered liberty, rights that are deemed natural, inalienable, to quote a famous American, and beyond the reach of politics. To circumscribe political activity, to make sure that interested majorities could not define rights and could not tyrannize either over minorities or individuals. It's in many ways not only a curb simply on the idea of government, but it's a curb specifically on the power of the legislature, on the power of Congress to exercise a tyrannical power against minorities or individuals and their rights. And this was a fundamental concern of Madison's. It's no mistake that Madison helped to write and get past these first 10 amendments in the first Constitution, or in the first session of the Congress. It was a fundamental concern of Madison's in writing Federalist 10, in the Federalist Papers, in building all these safeguards into our Constitution, that the one thing that we really have to fear in a popular government is the unchecked power of an interested majority. They're tyrannical by nature, by human nature. So we need these precautions, we need these limitations in order to have a safe politics. So I'll leave a little time for questions. So in conclusion, I'll say this. We should seek to remember why the Constitution contains these undemocratic features. We should remind ourselves why human nature has not changed, why we should still be aware and concerned about the unchecked power of a majority, that we should be concerned about our rights and the rights of the minority. In fact, I would go as far as to say it is a uniquely American concern for minority rights to have these limitations placed on majorities, that we need a certain constitutional space between the people and their government that allows for wisdom, deliberation, and moderation. I want to quote from a political scientist named Harvey Mansfield in talking about what he deems a constitutional, what he calls the constitutional space, or you might even call it a breathing room that the Constitution gives us between popular will and the government. He says, constitutional space allows for a government by the people, but it keeps that government at a distance from the people, so that the government, while remaining popular, will be wise and moderate as possible. And I say that is what is truly the American spirit of the Constitution. Thank you for your attention.
If we have any questions, I'm going to ask that you say them into the microphone, because we have the microphone here. Does anybody have any questions for Dr. Courser? Thoughts? Yep.
First, thank you for your talk. That was very engaging. I was wondering what you think about the decision to leave voting up to the states, as to whether or not you would consider that an undemocratic feature, and if you know any of the background of why the framers decided to leave voting up to the states.
Good question, and the answer is no. It's funny, teaching American government and talking about the Constitution, and particularly talking about federalism and what it is that states do and what it is that the federal government does, that the Constitution gives tremendous detail to what the federal government can and cannot do. And then we're left to assume what it is that the states can do. We define them today as police powers, the health, safety, welfare, morals of state citizens. But the Constitution does actually bother to say that it is states that will be in charge of elections. And why is it that the founders wanted to specify that? Well, it was actually a concern that the federal government could become in some way corrupt, and that they could dictate terms of elections to the states. That it was not an obvious but potential way in which the federal government could seek to aggrandize its power over the state governments, and that giving the states this power was essentially a check on federal power. So it's a small one, but I believe it fits into the notion of checks and balances, in this case between the states and the federal government.
Any other questions?
We hardy band.
I have one over there.
Thank you so much. I've really enjoyed your talk. One of the trends that we seem to be seeing, and I think in the existing election cycle, we see a move and a frustration with potential restrictions on democracy. So, for example, in the Democratic primary, we had a large controversy over delegates and whether it should be elected delegates or if there could be superdelegates. And though that didn't happen so much on the Republican side, there were certainly discussions about that. And there does seem to be this general predisposition or interest in a more democratic way that our institutions should run. Do you see a tension there, or do you think that this is more contemporary? But do you see that those kinds of pressures not might ultimately affect the political parties, but try to affect those mechanisms within the Constitution to be more democratic, either through such things as, online voting or plebiscites, or certainly the referendum and the initiative process?
Well, the short answer is yes. This is an absolute conflict and a problem for us in contemporary politics. I mean, the last thing you mentioned was the referendum process, and I just heard yesterday that the California ballot will be some 200 pages. Who could possibly be expected to parse that in any effective way? We have a surfeit of democracy today, I think. Speaking in particular about parties and the way in which they select their candidates. You're absolutely right, and this was a tension, not only in the Republican Party, but the Democratic Party, to say that we need more intra-party democracy. That is to say, the party and its members, by absolute majority, should decide who their candidate should be. And what's interesting about this, I think, is, well, we can see what the result of that is. I mean, if we want to extend the analogy of what I called constitutional space to the parties have no place for judgment. They're simply a mechanism by which people express the people broadly, and how we can parse that a million different ways. And when we think about how the primaries are run, some are caucuses, some are open primaries, some are closed primaries. There's so many different ways in which we decide what a party member is. That's the first problem. Then going beyond that, then we think about what is it that a party is supposed to do? Is it supposed to be simply a mechanism for people to express their will, or should there be some deliberative judgment by their leadership? And I think the Democrats decided in the 1980s that, yes, there should be some deliberate judgment by the leadership, and that's the origins of the superdelegate. You can take this assumption back to the McGovern Commission in the early 70s that was trying to reform the way and make more democratic the way in which Democrats selected their candidates. And what they found was that if you make an incredibly democratic intra-party democracy process, what you get is an extremely ideological candidate that cannot be elected by the American people, or are very unlikely to be elected. I mean, it's no mistake that George McGovern became the nominee in '72 and went down in flames. The Democratic Party reasserted itself in a certain way by adding the superdelegates. Republicans did not do the same. In some ways, Republicans, I think, were somewhat asleep at the wheel in terms of how states have continually, because it's ultimately, as you said, the states that decide how elections run, They've pushed the Republican Party further and further into basically an assumption that is, our nominee will be elected by a plebiscite. And we're just here to help that to happen. And I think that's a mistake. The problem with that, of course, is how do you gainsay it? How do you talk against democracy? How is it in a self-governing society that praises the idea of self-government, the idea of democracy above almost all else? How do you walk back democracy? I don't know. I really don't know. But it's a problem that I grapple with. And it's a subject of the speech I gave today, to try to remind ourselves that simply because something is undemocratic does not mean it is illegitimate.
There you go. And this will be our last question for the day.
Earlier this morning, Rick Hansen spoke briefly about money and politics. My question to you is, with the creation of PACs, to what extent do you believe that undermines or promotes this understanding of our undemocratic Constitution?
Ooh, that's a big subject. Yeah. Well, one thing I was going to mention, and I think it's a good transition between the two questions, is who is it that shows up to vote for a presidential primary? It's a very interested sort. Somebody who pays a lot more attention to politics, much more ideological, much more cued into a certain kind of ideological point of view, and that's reflected in the selection. One of the paradoxes of our government, and this is something that Alexis de Tocqueville pointed out to us in the early 19th century, is that you can create a strange paradox in a self-governing society when the people no longer choose to participate. What do you call a self-governing society that demands and depends upon people to vote and voice their opinion when they no longer do so? What does that government look like? Well, Tocqueville has a certain image of that I'll commend you to look at your Tocqueville again, but it's not a very nice one. It's one that looks somewhat like what he calls an administrative despotism. But to get to your point about campaign finance, why is it that campaign finance continue, and I totally disagree, or totally agree that campaign finance is a disaster in terms of the way in which it serves our politics today. Why is it so important? And I would say to you, it is precisely because there are so many factions, interested factions, that are well organized, well funded, and very knowledgeable and present in Washington and throughout the states, and very involved in our elections. And I don't know that there's a sufficient counterweight to their influence these days, being exercised by the people through the ballot box. They enjoy almost unprecedented influence in our policymaking. But I think in many ways the reason is not conspiratorial. Madison told us about factions. They've existed time immemorial. Madison had to deal with his own factions in his own time. But why is it that they are of particular concern today? And I would say that because we live in a self-governing society where not enough of us participate and are active and involved, even in the small ways that are necessary to being involved. And I think the idea of citizenship and the idea of being involved in our politics will become, even more of an emergency and an emerging crisis, and campaign finance in particular, the more this happens. And last thing I'll say is I don't believe that it's conspiratorial. I don't see that it's some grand interest lording over us. I think, when the people concert themselves and they make a decision, it's virtually impossible for any interest to oppose them. But the question is, and I think it's a question that faces not only the United States, but Europe, France, the UK, and that is, how do we solve this dilemma, this problem of a self-governing society that loses interest in politics? Because I think that's a very dangerous thing. And I think Tocqueville reminds us that a people who become so sick of themselves politically, they no longer find institutions legitimate, they no longer believe in self-government, that the alternative will be to fall before the feet of a single person. Because above all, we want order. Thank you.